This video is made in partnership with Brush Galaxy. Okay, welcome to another iPad painting tutorial. On today's tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint a misty, cloudy forest scene at the top of the kind of mountain setting. I'm using the app Procreate as usual on an iPad, and if you want to follow along exactly as I'm showing you, then the brushes you'll need to use within airbrushing, I'm using the soft brush and I'll also be using the medium brush. In addition to that, within the artistic brushes, I'll be using the leatherwood brush, but I'm going to adjust it slightly. So if we tap on it, go to the grain, turn the scale of that grain down to none, click done, and it's taken away some of the texture within that grain, but retains shape, the dappled appearance of it, which is perfect. In terms of the colours, I've pre-selected some colours here. If you want to use these colours, then look in the description of the video. There is a link to my Patreon page and you can download them there for free. The codes are also in the description, so if you want to put them in manually, you just go to the value section, type them into where it says hexadecimal, press enter, the colour appears up here, and then you can start tapping it into your canvas area, or your palette area I should say. Please do bear in mind that sometimes the colours are a little bit off, a little bit oversaturated on the video due to the camera that I'm using, which is why I provide the colour codes, so you can make sure that it's definitely accurate to the painting I'm producing as well. Okay, with all that being said, let's go to our first layer. We're going to go back to our airbrushing, soft brush, we'll put it up at around 10%, and that's the size, and we'll put it at 100% opacity. We need to select the colour now, and we're going to go to the first colour on the first row. This blue colour. If I go onto the disc, you'll see exactly where it falls on the colour disc, and I'm just going to do a stripe across, maybe thicken it up slightly like that, and then I'm going to go to my adjustments, my Gaussian blur. I want to affect the whole layer, and I'm just going to blur it in to about 50% like that. Then I'm going to create another layer. We'll do it on separate layers to begin with. We can always then merge them down. We'll go to our colours, we'll select this middle colour of the three colours that we're going to use for the sky, and we're going to do something similar again, but I'm going to have the brush size a little bit bigger, so I'm going to put it up to, I don't know whether you can see there, but I'm going to put it up to around 15%, but I'm going to turn the opacity down to about 50%. In fact, I'm going to turn it further down to about 30%, and I'm just going to lightly now start to add some more of that colour in. Now I actually want this layer to be less impactful than the blue, so I'm going to move it so it goes underneath the blue. So it's added to the mix, but the blue has a priority. So the order of the layers already is going to be a little bit mixed up. They are still numbered, so when I refer to them later on, you're not going to get too confused because I'll tell you which layer that we're talking about. We'll create another layer now, then we'll go back to the colours. We'll select this third colour along, this pink colour. We'll turn the size of the brush down again to about 10%, and we'll keep it at around the 30% opacity. And I just want to, in this area at the bottom now, start introducing some of this pink colour. So it's going to be quite strong initially, and then we're going to fade it in. Then we'll go to the Gaussian blur. So adjustments, Gaussian blur. Once I affect that whole layer, and we'll just blur that in. And somewhere to around the 30% on the blur, Gaussian blur is good. We'll have a look at that a little bit later on, see how it marries up with everything else, but that's our starting point. We'll create another layer, but we'll put this layer on top now. So we'll move it up to the very top. So again, all the layers are jumbled up, but this is now layer 4. So on this new layer, we're going to use the medium brush. I'm going to put it at around 3% size and 100% opacity. And we're just going to use it to define where we want the land to come in. It's going to have some sections that stick up, and it's the distant kind of mountain. Once we've done that all the way across so it joins at both sides, then we can just drag the colour into that area and it fills it in. Now when you zoom in, you'll notice it's left a gap because we're on the medium brush and that edge is slightly soft, so it doesn't fill it up to the very edge. So we can redo that but do it better. We drag it into that area. Without letting go of the Apple Pencil, we can just slide it across and it really has disappeared that little gap, which is great. Now you might find that we've lost some of that colour that was in the background, that pink colour. So what we can do, if that's the case, is go back to the layer 3, we'll go to the transform tool, which is there, and we can just adjust it, move it up a little bit. And if we want to condense it even, we can go into the freeform setting, which is down here, and that will allow us to squash it a little bit, concentrate it in one particular area, and put it exactly where we want it to go. Now sometimes you may get to a point and you think, well, I wish I'd done it a little bit richer, more intense, another trick that we can do with this now is to duplicate that layer. So if we just slide that across and duplicate it, you'll notice that you've got a much stronger version of it now. And they're both called layer 3, so we can just condense them together, and now we're back to just the one layer, which is layer 3. Again, we can do a little bit of shuffling it around until we're absolutely happy with it. So we want it just a little bit peaking above, but it doesn't want to encroach too much into the sky. We'll go back to layer 4. And what I want to do with the top edge of that, because it looks very crisp, very neat, we want to add texture and perhaps reduce the sharpness of it. So we're going to go to the smudge tool this time. We'll go to the soft brush, and I'm going to reduce the size to 2%, and the opacity we'll have at 100%. And if you zoom in along this top edge, we're just going to create a slightly nibbled effect. In fact, let's turn the size of the brush to the lower end of 2%, almost at 1%. And we're just going to push the blue upwards in some places more than others, but generally we're going to go all the way across. It just creates the effect when you zoom out that there's trees, there's rocks, there's other details, other things there breaking up that line. So I'll zoom in a little bit again. You don't need to be too precious about this, just it does help the overall effect though. Keep it slightly random, some bits will want to stick up more than others. So we're going to do lots of trees in our foreground, so we can only imagine, because there's going to be a lot of trees here, then there's probably a lot of trees in the distance as well. That just breaks up the texture, it improves the overall effect. So we're going to create another layer on top. So this is layer 5 now. And we're going to move along to the last two colours, and we're going to create some features in the sky, some just wisps of cloud, nothing too complex. We'll go to this blue colour first. We'll stay on actually we'll go back to the soft brush again. We'll reduce the size of that to about 3%, and we'll have the opacity really quite low at around 15%. And I'll just move into different areas and just some light taps. Really just suggestions that we have some clouds wisping in there. We don't want this to be something we spend a long time on. This is just a suggestion of something really. Now you'll probably notice with the brushes that I'm using for this tutorial, I'm not going to get heavily into textures. I'm just using some of the basic brushes that are within Procreate. However, if you want to create more interesting textures and experiment, then you might want to head over to Brush Galaxy. It's the first and only Procreate brushes subscription service. And I've had a look there, and you can unlock access to over 20,000 premium Procreate brushes and save over 90%. So there are more than 12 different brush categories. So it has things like portrait, pattern, texture, and nature, many more, and actually save yourself a bit of time. So you can start a free trial starting today, unlock up to 12 premium Procreate brush packs worth up to $300 for free. There's a link in the video description and in the comments section at the top. So if you want to support this channel, it's a really good way of doing that. And at the same time, gaining yourself some really cool brushes. And we can turn the brush size down a little bit to 2%, lower end of 2%, just as you can see, just slight suggestions here. There's no need to get bogged down in the detail of it. It's on a soft brush. We're just tapping it in lightly, and that's actually sufficient kind of detail for this element. We'll take it across there a little bit as well, maybe another one here. Then I'm going to go back to the colours. Use the pink colour now, do the same thing, but as we bring it further down, we're heading towards the pink here, so those little wisps of cloud should be closer in colour to the colour down there as well. Okay, so we're going to create another layer. And we've used all the colours on this layer. We're going to come back to the middle layer of colours. We've got 5 there as well, and we've got 5 colours at the bottom. So I'm going to start using the bottom 5 colours to begin with. We want to start adding in some of these cloud effects for the distance to begin with. So on this first colour, we're going to go back to our brushes. We want the soft brush. We want the top end of 2%, but we want it quite low, again at around the 15% opacity. And we're just going to start with slightly circular motions. So it's not dashes this time, not this shape. It's got a slight curve to it. So I'm doing a big version here, but you can see it's that type of movement to begin with. And I'm bringing it in at the edge, allowing it to build up a little bit. We can also use the smudge tool to disrupt and blend this in a little bit too, but we may also start with the actual brush tool to try and paint it on rather than just smudging. We'll use a combination of techniques and brushes and things. So we'll go all the way across. Let's turn the size of the brush up, in fact. Let's put it at around 3%, because we can always go back in and refine it. Let's go for it. Let's put it 4%, see how that works. It'll just allow us to speed it up a little bit. I always start with a cautious mind and go with a smaller brush, and then you can always amplify it up. Use the bigger brushes once you feel that you can be a bit bolder. So I'm going to take this all the way across. Then I'm going to turn the size of the brush up to 10% and the opacity up to 25%. And I'm just going to start bringing that colour generally down into our scene. I'm just doing it in bold stripes all the way down. We're going to have other things obscuring this anyway, but I just want to make sure that now we have a focus of the dark colour, that dark blue, where the mountain is, and then we've got lighter colours that represent the clouds. This is just the background layer of cloud. We're going to pretty much go over the top of this with other colours, but it just gets us started. Okay, so we'll go back to our colours, and I want to pick this second colour along now. I'm going to reduce the brush back down again to around 3%. We'll keep it at the 25% though. And I'm just going to start breaking up this shape. Maybe have some sections perhaps where it's picking up the light a little bit more. In fact, let's turn the opacity down a little bit. It is still quite strong, quite powerful. So we'll put it back down to 15%. I'm going to just add a little bit more of that light colour near the top there. Then maybe we have a break, and maybe we're just creating bands at this point. So another section will return to this shape rather than straight lines. We'll bring some of that across. Let's turn the size of the brush up a little bit to 5%. Bring that across. So we're adding more texture and more layers to our cloud. Let's go back to our colours. We have a third colour along now. We'll use this a little bit more sparingly. So we'll turn the size of the brush down to 2%. We'll keep it at the 15% opacity. And we'll just use this to help pick out perhaps the top edge of some of these cloud sections, perhaps for more of a highlight effect. Like so. Now, one thing that I think would be really useful, we're still all doing this on the same layer, so this is just the general cloud that is covering a large area. So what I want to do is slightly merge it in with the distant colours. So I'm going to go back to my colours. I'm going to go to this first pink, the middle colour on the top row, and I'm going to have it just creeping in here, so we're merging a little bit of the sky with the cloud. We'll put it at around 5% size, and we'll turn the opacity quite low though, so we'll put the opacity at around 5%. And what I want to do is just go over it a little bit so it brings the two together. So I'm going to add a hint of it into the cloud, perhaps that's even too much. Once or twice onto that cloud and the mountains, and we'll try it over this side as well, just so we're bringing them together a little bit, but not too much, like that. I'm also going to try and mix in a little bit of lighter blue, so I'm going to go for this fourth colour in there. And I'm also going to use some of that colour just to knock back some sections of the mountain. We want more of a misty effect, especially at the bottom and all the way across, like that. Now, as I was saying before, we can use the smudge tool. So let's go to the smudge tool, click on it so we can see how we're using it. We'll use the soft brush. So it's the soft brush texture within smudge, and we'll put the size at around 2%, and we'll put the strength at around 70%. And what we can do is we can go in fact that's too small a size. Let's increase the brush size a little bit to top end of 2%. And what you can do is you can just push the top edge of some of these cloud details. If you feel like you want to just define them a little bit more in places, you just want to specifically create a certain edge, then you can use that smudge tool, and it doesn't add any new color. It just pushes around what you've already created, and you can just have a little bit of a play with that, and it can be really useful. A really nice way of not dramatically changing what you've got, but just tidying and pushing things around a little bit. I think that's a really good way of not messing up what you've got, but just playing with it a little bit. So we can push some of that lighter colour up to the edge and then bring it down from the top edge so we can create a slightly sharper edge in places, if that's what we want. Okay, I'll come back to that. I think that's looking okay for now. We're going to create another layer on top. And what I'm going to do with this layer is I'm going to change my brush to the artistic brushes, and I want that leatherwood brush. Now I want it quite small, so I'm going to turn it down to 2%, and I'm going to put it at around 70% opacity, but we need to select the right colour. So we're going to use this first colour in the middle row, and let's just have a look at the power of that. It might be that we need to use the opacity of the layer to fix this, but we'll start with that effect. And what I'm going to imagine is there's bits of trees that are just starting to stick up in this area. So they're just the tops of the spikes perhaps. So the top bit of the very tree is just sticking above the clouds in certain areas. So you don't need to do anything other than just a suggestion of it sticking up. And it's a very textured brush, so it stops you from being too awkward with the shapes. We're just creating a sense that there's something there anyway. And what I suggest that we do here is perhaps a few more over the other side as well. But I'm really going to subdue these with the eraser in a moment anyway, because the opacity is quite strong on that. We could have put a lower opacity, but subduing it with the eraser is a really good way of controlling which bits that we're going to subdue the most. So we can use the soft brush within eraser. We'll put the size at 3% and the opacity at around 40%. Now we'll zoom in, and I want to mainly subdue the bottom edge of that texture to begin with, because it's disappearing behind cloud, and that really helps soften it in. We can do that for both sides. But I also want to generally subdue it, so we can just subdue it until we feel that it's looking about right. So it's just a suggestion of something there. We don't want to have it too powerful. Subtlety is the key with with these kind of details. So we'll just go over it lightly, have it disappearing more and more into this section. Perhaps a little bit darker over here, but again, not too much, like that. I feel that works. If we want to get rid of the sharpness of some of that texture, we can go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, affect that whole layer, and just blur it in slightly. It's only doing that whole layer, nothing else. So we can blur it into about 1.5 or 2%. That looks pretty good. Zoom out, and again, it's just stopped it being too sharp. It's added the effect without being over the top. So I'm going to create another layer. And this time I'm going to add a kind of middle distance set of trees. So it's going to be in our horizon, on our landscape, it's going to be lower down, but that usually represents something that's closer to you as well. Normally, the nearer something gets to the horizon, it kind of indicates that it's a little bit further away. Depends on your viewpoint, but as a general rule, the closer something is to the horizon line, the more distant it will be. So we'll bring it a little bit further away, a bit lower down. Again, we're going to be on our brushes. So we're on the leatherwood brush. We'll stick to the same settings, which I just remind you is 2% size and 70% opacity. But we're going to go to the colours, and we're going to pick the second colour along this time. Again, we can subdue and erase, but if we start bold, then we'll remove as we go. So I'm going to aim for something in this kind of area. So we want the peaks, the tops of our trees, and we can start with that perhaps. I'm not even going to draw a tree trunk for these. I'm just going to move left and right. Leave some gaps in our trees, because if you just have it completely solid, which occasionally it will be, but if you leave all of them completely filled in, they're going to look a little bit lifeless, not realistic. So gaps are important in our trees. We're not going to see the bottom part of these trees, so I'm letting it disappear into nothing. And we'll start with a few next to each other. So left and right with this texture. We can bump into each other, that isn't an issue. Maybe do a shorter one next to it. Maybe this can be slightly denser so we don't have as many gaps with this one. And that's okay sometimes, as long as they're not all like that. And then we'll have another one here. A little bit vaguer on that one. I'm going to do a whole series of them next to each other. And I'm going to subdue these so we're not too focused on how believable these are as individual trees. We're just getting an effect for this point. So that will do, in fact. So what I'm going to do with this layer is go back to the eraser. We're still in the same settings as before because we've not changed it. So we should be on 3% size and 40% opacity. And I'm just going to now start erasing from the bottom. making the bottom part of these trees disappear, and I can keep going over it, blend them in. So imagine it just like shading. So the more you press on, the more it will have a powerful impact. And then I'm allowing it to have less impact the further I go up. So the bottom of those trees is completely getting lost in the cloud, and you're just starting to see the top section emerge like that. Now, in addition to that, I'm going to go to my layer, and I'm going to turn the opacity down a little bit as well. So let's see how far we can push this effect. So we're going to have some that are going to be really quite light and some that are quite dark. So I'm going to turn this down to 60% like that. And then I'm going to create another layer. In fact, before we create that other layer, before we move on, so I'll delete that layer. Before we do anything, we're still on layer 8. Let's soften the details in. So we'll go to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur, just like we did last time, layer, and we'll blur it across, perhaps a little bit less this time, not quite the 2%. Perhaps we'll do it to about 1.5%, something like that, or thereabouts. We'll go again, we'll create that other layer. So now we're on layer 9, same brush settings as before. We don't need to change them. We're still using that second blue along, but this time we're going to do some trees that are slightly in front. But this time we're going to do some trees that perhaps are slightly in front of these ones. So we're going to move them just a hint downwards, but not much different at all really. So if you want to just do a line down the middle to represent the trunk, you can do. It may just show up there a hint more with the ones that are slightly more foreground, but we don't really need to go into any sharp detail with them. We'll save that kind of detail for the very foreground trees. As we get further down, we can just start to merge them together. We'll have fewer gaps, and we're going to erase some of that anyway, so it doesn't really matter. These, again, are relatively rough. As long as we get the spike at the top and a few gaps here and there, then the effect is going to work. Let's move that upwards slightly so we've got less of a distance between them. So we're going to go to the transform. I'm just going to move them slightly closer together so we've got more of a cluster of trees that are actually next to each other. So that works a little bit better. We'll go back to our eraser tool. We'll put it up to about the 4% size. In fact, no, let's go 5% size. We'll stick on the 40% opacity. And I'm just going to, again, subdue the bottom of these trees, get rid of them, erase them, so they completely blend away. But I'm allowing the top sections of those trees just to be a hint darker than the ones that are immediately behind them. So, again, adjustments, Gaussian blur, affect that whole layer and just blur it in slightly to about the 1.5%. So what I'm going to do is go back to layer 8 and I'm actually going to subdue it even more. So I'm going to just take that back to about 50% opacity. And I think that just helps push them back a little bit more and pushes the other one further forward. And I'm going to condense layers 8 and 9 now. So it just becomes layer 8. That way I can then take those two layers and I'm just going to move them a hint up so it leaves me a little bit more space to do more things in the foreground. So somewhere about there I think works. Then we'll go back to our layers, create another layer, and we're going to basically repeat the process but be a bit more precise this time. So we're going to create tree trunks to begin with. So this time we'll go to our brushes, go to the airbrushing and the medium brush, and we'll turn it to 2% size and about 80% opacity. Now I'm going to decide where to put some taller trees, so I'm going to draw the tree trunk first. In fact, that's too big a brush size. Let's turn it down to the very bottom of the 2%. Now there is a scale within even the same number, so the top end of 2% is a wider brush than the lower end of 2%. So I put it to the very lower end of 2%, and I just want to draw a tree trunk in, just as my guide. We're not going to see the bottom of the tree, it's just going to be like a silhouette really. And we'll draw a few of them, so there's going to be clusters. Now it's not that really you have to think about every single tree trunk as needing branches coming off it, but I think just to define a general sense of where they're going to go, it will help you. Something like that to begin with. Then we'll go back to our brushes. We'll go to the artistic brush, the leatherwood brush. We'll put it up slightly to the top end of 2%. And again, we'll keep it at the 70% opacity. Go back to our colours. Now, I'm going to move along to the fourth colour this time. And you should see it's quite a bit darker than the other colours that we've used. And I'm going to use the same technique. So we'll pick the top of our spike, and I'm just going to be a bit more careful this time. So perhaps leave some more gaps at the top and just left to right, just as a general kind of swinging motion as we go. Maybe some of these branches can point up at the top because they're still quite light at the top. Maybe some of them, when they get further down, gravity starts to pull them, and rather than being up like this rather, then they start to bend down instead. But certainly the top of the trees is going to have branches that spike up. And as you can see, I'm taking a little bit more time with this. I want this to be a bit more apparent in the landscape, so I'm carefully doing this one and carefully doing all of these. Don't get too wide. Keep it as a general shape. If you start fanning out too much, it's going to just become ridiculous at the bottom of the tree. So I've gone too far with that one, but it doesn't matter because that bit of that tree is going to be obscured by the next one anyway. But just be aware of it. So we'll start another one next to it. Similar kind of technique. They're all going to be a little bit different, so try to vary it up a little bit. And move across, move to other ones. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit, fast forward a little bit, so you can start to see the overall effect without watching me draw them all in relative slow motion. So I'll speed up because the effect is just basically the same for each tree. The same technique, it's just multiplied. Now you can copy and paste, but I'm not really convinced that that's going to give you the same quality effect. So we'll do them all individually, we'll do it the proper way, we'll do it manually. There are a couple of things that I can show you to help speed up the process as well. Some cheats if you like, but we'll do most of it manually. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit. Once we get a reasonable distance down, we're not going to get any light, any gaps, because we're going to have so many trees all gathered together. We can just go over that area like that. So it's really just the top edge that's actually going to be important for us. So once we have created that section, what we can do is we can move it over there as well. So a slight cheat, but we'll go into the selection tool, freehand, draw around that part because we don't want those copied as well. Close the loop, 3 fingers down, and we want to copy, 3 fingers down again, and then paste. And then we can just move those over to the other area, perhaps change them up a little bit, so increase the size, something like that. And then obviously we then need to perhaps just go into that edge and continue where we left off on that edge, but it's just sped the process up a little bit. There's nothing wrong with using the tools to your advantage. It's still your drawing that you're copying. It's not a problem. It's more of just a duplication, doubling up of that effect. You want to be careful. You don't want to do it too much because you'll start to notice mirroring of certain shapes and you don't want that. And if you're concerned about that, then you can just go work back into it a little bit more in places just to disguise the fact that you have done that. And you'll find that many digital artists will use that exact technique really of copying things, and then a little bit of disguising goes a long way. So again, if we want to add some more tree trunks, we can go to our airbrushing, medium brush. We're going to need some more in addition to what we did before, so we'll just add some more here. Go back to the artistic brush, the leatherwood brush, and we can continue. So there's going to be 1 or 2 that really just perhaps stand out on their own, so they need to have a little bit more time and care applied to them, just to make sure that they're working the best out of all the other trees. We can even go to a darker colour, so we can go to this very dark colour now. You'll notice that I'm still on that layer where I made a copy. We could always condense it down if we wanted. We'll keep that layer as a different layer, but we're now working on this top layer, which is layer 9. So I'm using this darker colour now on this very foreground tree, just to bring it forward a little bit. We'll go back a couple of colours again, just to do these ones, because they need to merge with these ones, and maybe they could even go lighter. We'll use the other colours to blend them in perhaps. We'll add them first. So again, we can look through our colours now, so we could go, for example, to this last colour on the bottom row. Now I'm going to use this with the airbrush, so we'll go back to our brushes, airbrushing soft brush, and we'll put it at around the 6%, but we're going to keep it really low at around 5% opacity. And what I want to do with this colour now is perhaps just subdue the bottom of it. Perhaps there's just hints of mist and cloud coming in here as well, just nibbling away at the bottom edge of these trees, just to soften them in. I think will help. And we could also attack the edge of these trees just to knock some of them back a little bit more as well. We could knock a whole section of these trees back a little bit, for example. So if we go over this and just knock them back, maybe less the top edge, but a little bit otherwise. Once we've done that, we've really created an opportunity to go back in now with a darker colour again. So again, pick this darkest colour on the middle row at the end. Back in with the artistic leatherwood brush. So we'll turn that down a little bit to 50% opacity. But we can just start bringing one or two trees a little bit further forward in that area now. And we're just layering up that detail really nicely, that area rather. So we can create the overall shapes of the trees. Don't have to overdo that section at all. Just a couple, maybe a couple over here as well. And then we can also go back in with the airbrushing medium brush. Should still be set to what we used before. We can just redefine that tree trunk in places, because these are really foreground ones now, so you will notice a tree trunk compared to others. You have one or two tree trunks that really don't have a lot growing on them, so you can add those in here and there, maybe just that one. I'll add a couple here as well. Again, back in with the leatherwood brush, and then just a hint of things growing on these as well. Maybe not as much though. Again, for this one, I'm going to turn the size back down to 2% for this leatherwood. Just be a bit more precise. Okay, I'm just going to go back to my layer 6, go back to my colours. I'm going to pick that lightest colour now, and I'm going to make sure I'm on the airbrush again, so go back to airbrushing soft brush, put it at around 3% size, turn it up a little bit to 10% opacity. So I'll just recap that. We've gone back to the airbrush, soft brush, we've changed the size to 3% and the opacity to 10%, and we've gone back to this middle colour here because it's quite a nice light colour. And I'm just going to work across now just to lighten up some of the highlights on the cloud a little bit. And it should be behind the trees. If we just double check, yeah, you can see it's behind the tree layers. So you don't have to worry about it interfering with the trees. So you can really enjoy adding some more of those colours, some of that brightness into these areas. And then I'm also going to increase the size of the brush up to about 10%, and I'm going to add a bit more of that light into this section generally. So just adds a bit more contrast, makes some sections pop out a little bit more effectively, I think. Looking at it, I just feel like that's a little bit too dark, so that's easy to fix. We'll go back to the layer that has that tree on it, which is layer 7. We'll go in with our eraser at 4% size and, I don't know, roughly 40% opacity, and just knock it back a little bit, and that instantly makes me believe that it's in the right kind of location. Okay, I'm going to leave that particular landscape here at this point. If you've enjoyed following along and you're pleased with the results, make sure to tag me over at Instagram or join my Facebook group and share it with me there. The links for those two things are down in the video description. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, and I shall see you back here soon. See you later.